Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Tanya Titchkosky, Video 1. In this video, I've got 3 tasks. First, I'm going to introduce you to the sociology of disability and to disability studies. Here we'll look back to some of the theory discussed in 226 and earlier in 227. Next, I'm going to introduce you to Michael Oliver, whose social model of disability is required reading in disability studies and the sociology of disability. This will get you ready to do the readings. Let's do it. When we talk about the sociology of disability, we are talking about sociological discourse that takes disability as its object. This means doing exactly what we've done throughout this class, looking at disability as it is institutionally distributed, wherever that might be. Perhaps we're talking about accessibility services here. What counts as disability and who decides? How does disability relate to other social institutions, like work? How has that changed over time? These are the kinds of questions sociologists have asked about gender and race before, and will now ask about disability. This approach differs somewhat from that of disability studies. Disability studies is an academic discipline in its own right, and here we can include people asking sociological questions about disability, but also those in English, geography, politics, and so on. The discipline is interested in asking questions not about the properties of particular bodies and how they function, but about how we accord to those bodies the labels of ability, disability, normal, and abnormal. Any time we label bodies and behavior as normal or abnormal, we can apply a disability studies lens. This can be done through sociological perspectives, looking at disabled bodies, but this is not the full extent of the enterprise. The emphasis is on the cultural production of ability more generally. Together, these approaches require some special terminology. The preferred term here is disability, referring to both a positive identity, I am a disabled person, and the outcome of social processes that exclude people. In this sense, disability is the outcome of disablement. We use ableism to talk about the preference for able bodies in societies like ours, to particular processes that exclude disabled bodies, and for acts that erase disability from the spectrum of humanity. In using these terms, we are rejecting some others. Let's look into this more closely. First, consider the terminology of special needs. That terminology suggests that body X contains a need for help. To this, disability studies would say, yes, but we all need kinds of help, and institutions deem only particular bodies and particular needs to be important. The perspective here is a shift from people needing assistance to institutions needing to label people as special. This isn't to say that special needs or special education shouldn't exist, but to show how there is a social process through which people are categorized, and one that says more about the institution's problems than people's problems. Or consider the term differently abled. Here, people doing disability studies would argue we are actively washing over the processes, institutional, individual, interpersonal, that are actively involved in dividing particular groups of people from others. Differently abled suggests that there is an equality between all types of abilities in society like ours. This is not true. It suggests that they are all welcome, and I can assure you that they are not. And it also suggests that disability can only refer to bodies that can't do stuff, and not to the outcome of societies that do not tolerate difference. Think about the gender pay gap in this country. This would be like referring to women as differently compensated, so long as we ignore the structural problems that exclude people. Women are not differently compensated, they are underpaid. This is an active political label we can use to make change, whereas simply being differently X doesn't offer much. So, disability, ability, ableism. We can also use a disability studies perspective to reorient existing work in sociology that doesn't address disability, but could. Let's look to the classics. For Marx, we can think about the different ways that organizing the economy organizes bodies. The term for different types of economies, Marx calls a mode of production. Since he was writing in the industrial age, we can ask, how did the advent of industrialization create new categories of who could work and who could not? Also, how do the different ways of producing goods produce different forms of impairment? When we think about Marx, we also think about how we sell our labor on the labor market. How is it, when we have to sell our labor like everyone else, different types of bodies get categorized? And how do we justify inclusion or exclusion of particular body types ideologically? Next, my favorite, Durkheim. Recall that for Durkheim, the individual is a social product. How is it, in particular societies, that people are made different because of various physical attributes or bodily characteristics? How, for Durkheim, is it normal to produce abnormality? We get a very different approach here than we do with Marx. It isn't industrial activity that produces disability, physical, mental, or otherwise, but rather particular forms of moral attachment. As societies become more advanced, so says Durkheim, we have new forms of attachment that need to be maintained through social policy and the like. For Durkheim, then, as a social fact, disability is normal in the same way as crime is normal. So long as there are rules, there are going to be people that act outside of them. Just as, if there are norms of bodily capacity, some bodies and minds are going to exist outside of them. Durkheim opens us up to a moral understanding of ability and bodily difference. Finally, Max Weber. I'll admit it. Weber is obviously the most boring theorist of the classical three. What is also particularly boring is his writing on bureaucracy. Remember Weber's rationalization thesis, that things are becoming more and more subject to the objective, calculable rules without regard for persons found in bureaucracy. There is nothing more modern, I would say, than the management of bodily ability and the ways in which we administer disability as a category in institutions like this one, Queen's University, or in medical classification. Coming up with objective classifications for bodies that do not fit the norm are as old as medicine itself. Exploring how various forms of classifications intersect, say in things like accessibility work or workplace accommodation, is very much a Max Weber kind of story. This is very much the approach to disability that Tanya Titchkosky has explored in her work, in applying a disability studies perspective to accessibility at the University of Toronto, and to government forms and documents in the book I'm going to tell you about in the next video. Sorry to all the Max Weber fans in the audience. Let's look to some more recent stuff. When I took my first sociology class in graduate school and mentioned my interest in disability, the first person that came to the professor's mind was Erving Goffman. And I'm sure you guys can understand why. Goffman's work is very pertinent when we think about the tiny ritual ways that we manage disability and ability in our everyday lives. Many forms of disability carry stigma. This is more than just a story of exclusion. Goffman is interested in how we manage that stigma. How is it that we declare we have a learning disability to a professor? Over and over and over. What is the little ritual that you follow when you offer someone your seat on the bus? Again, the focus here is not on whether particular social roles are valorized or not, but the mechanisms where we act that valorization out. Like Durkheim, Goffman is interested in moral attachments and how we live through them. Moral attachments, of course, are not simply abstract. And here we can think of Goffman's work on total institutions, cut off from the rest of the world around us. How we organize life in care facilities, says Goffman, is of crucial sociological importance. Here we can do disability studies. Next, Michel Foucault. Of the theories presented here, Foucault's is the most pertinent to Titchkosky's work, since he's interested in how we tell the truths of disability, how we produce particular types of subjectivities, and how we act on them once we do. Of all the theorists after the Second World War, I would say that Foucault probably had the most influence on disability studies. Just as Goffman explores the life of total institutions in terms of interpersonal interaction, Foucault explores the government of disability in terms of its institutional distribution. Who has authority over disability? And how does the way we manage disability change over time? These kinds of questions are deeply important to the knowledge-power framework as deployed by Foucault and his followers. Again, another site to do disability studies. Finally, at least for the 6 theories I want to cover here, actor network theory. Actor network theorists like Bruno Latour, Anne-Marie Moll, and John Law are interested in how particular material networks shape agency. Disability and ability, at least in this perspective, are about the outcome of particular organizational components working together. Here, then, one isn't abled or disabled in a firm or permanent way, but only when particular material arrangements cause one of those states to exist. In one of my favorite examples, one of John Law's students, Michael Schillmeier, did a study of blindness and money use. Schillmeier was interested in how those with visual impairments manage their money, in terms of sorting out bills and coins, and how in particular rushed moments they wouldn't be able to use these systems, such as when they took the bus and had to rush on according to a fast schedule. Blindness only really emerges when it is forced to, in moments where currency arrangements are incompatible with paying a bus fare quickly. What Schillmeier says is that it isn't only bodies that can't see that make blindness emerge, but particular social and material situations, and the speeds that we presume people should be able to act in them. So when we think about networks that distribute agency, and thus disability and ability, commerce is a great example. In sum, we can say that sociological perspectives on disability and disability studies don't look to inherent attributes of disability as pathological, but rather look to the social, material, and cultural spaces where they come to be regarded as such. Next, we're going to look at the work of Michael Oliver, whose social model of disability was crucial in shaping the field of disability studies. This is Michael Oliver. In the UK, his name is synonymous with disability studies, as is his social model of disability. This is a social oppression theory of disability. Oliver was the first disability studies professor in the United Kingdom and was the founding editor of Disability in Society, or what used to be named Disability, Handicap and Society. What's important here is that Oliver sought to make disability studies into its own discipline, outside of sociology, education, rehabilitation, etc. Oliver argues that disability studies, interdisciplinary as it may be, has its own contributions to make outside of the concerns of those other disciplines. So just as Durkheim sought to establish sociology as a discipline in its own right, Oliver did the same for disability studies, and used his position as editor of that journal to do so. Oliver coined the so-called social model of disability in Social Work with Disabled People. Though the book was born before I was, it still shapes the field of disability studies to this day. Let's look at the social model of disability in greater detail. The most important part of the social model is the distinction between disability and impairment. Oliver argues that disability is a form of social oppression which is produced by social barriers. Oliver wants to argue that while individual medical conditions are distinct from one another, that people with disabilities are excluded from common social life is universal. So, the distinction between disability and impairment is the distinction between functional restriction and social restriction. This is not just a matter of definition, but a matter of the collective politics on which we must organize the disabled person's movement. Oliver argues that too many sociological approaches to disability have mistaken disability as an internal problem, when in fact, disabled people are produced by a society that will not accommodate them. For Oliver, to account for social oppression, we must use disability and distinguish it from individual impairments. For Oliver, disability politics require us to challenge medicalization. When we talk about medicalization, we are talking about the misattribution of problems caused by society to problems faced by individual bodies. This Oliver will also call the personal tragedy view of disability. Oliver is going to argue that when public policy thinks about disability solely as a medical problem, it ignores all the non-medical exclusion that is faced by people in their everyday lives, something that is best addressed by disabled persons' organizations and not the medical establishment. Again, this ignores problems of social organization and instead blames disabled people for their own exclusion. I should indicate that this isn't saying that medicine is all pretend, but there are other ways of thinking about disability outside the confines of disease or rehabilitation. The practical importance of this is found in including the voices of people living with a disability in public policy, not solely the voices of those who fix them. Note the quotation marks around fix in the transcript. You're going to have to put on your Marxist hats for this last point. Lastly, Oliver argues that under capitalism, the structure of work is the primary cause of disability. Because people cannot sell their labor in the same form, because of the structure of alienation, we attribute them abnormal labels that say much more about the structure of work than they do about the structure of individual bodies. When we accommodate a worker, we are simply trying to adjust them to the commodity form of the ideal laborer than anything else. Thus, disability is ideologically supported. Let me conclude with a point on Michael Oliver and Erving Goffman. Not only does Oliver apply sociological theory to disability, but he was also very opposed to particular social theorists that would not have accepted the aims of the social model. First and foremost here is Erving Goffman. Oliver and other social model thinkers really despise Goffman because he was not interested in structural questions about how we shape disability, but only how it is managed. You can see here on the slide that Oliver is very opposed to the way in which the stigma literature looks on disability. Oliver is interested in the structure of work and not its interpretation. In this sense, Goffman only really looks to a slice of life, how we make meaning, and not the material conditions where that meaning is made. Because Oliver is a macro-level thinker and one interested in barrier removal and activist research, Goffman doesn't really have a place for him. And indeed, the same approach can be applied to anyone who cares more about meaning than materialism. So, like Judith Butler, for example. So, while I think that Goffman counts as somebody doing disability studies, Oliver would argue that he is not. I'll let you decide which argument you think is more compelling. Okay, that's it for me for now. Now I'd like you to go do the readings. As you're reading through Titchkosky's piece, think about Foucault and discourse. That is, I think, the biggest influence on her writing, whereas for Michael Oliver, that's Karl Marx. See you in the next video.